Good evening, everybody. It's good to be here again on session 5 of our Holocaust series, and I'm pleased to be able to bring this to you from my home in North Wales, Bethel House, and it's good to be with you. And thank you for all your comments and your emails and your WhatsApp messages about the course, because it's very encouraging. I've got one thing to ask you right from the beginning, and that is, it's my anniversary next Wednesday, and I can't take Shirley out, but we're going to have a meal and just make it a special evening. So would you mind if we skip next week as far as the teaching is concerned? But I have actually got something for you to do anyway, and I'm going to ask you if you will do this, because tonight's series 5 is about ghettos. And one of the best films that I've ever seen about a ghetto is the true story of a musician who survived Warsaw ghetto, and it's a film by Roman Polanski, and it's called The Pianist. Some of you may have watched it, but if you can watch this next week instead of listening to me, I'm sure this will be more entertaining for you. But a lot of the things that we say tonight, that I teach tonight, will be made real through this film. So instead, would you turn this film, and it's on Netflix. You'll also get it on other channels. If you're stuck, you can't find the film, maybe you can email me and we'll try and get this to you in one way or another. But it's really a really interesting film, and as I say, it will meld in with a lot of the teaching tonight. But I've got some book recommendations for you as well tonight, and this book here by Avram Torrey is a wonderful book. It's a diary of his time in Kovno ghetto. It's a ghetto diary. It's absolutely fascinating. It's dated. It's chronological. It tells the story of his life in Kovno ghetto, and that's Avram Torrey. And I also have here 2 volumes of studies on ghettos by the renowned and amazing historians from Yad Vashem. And they're quite expensive, actually, these 2 volumes. And I was really blessed, and I can't thank Ephraim K and Steffi K from Yad Vashem, who this year sent me these 2 volumes, which are absolutely amazing. So thank you again, my dear friends from Israel, and I'm really blessed. But these 2 volumes tell us a detailed story about ghettos, but you can get them from Yad Vashem website. It's really interesting. And I have here for you a recommendation as well by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and this is part 2 or part B of a 7-volume series. Now, when you have a look, if you go to the Washington Holocaust Museum Memorial website, you'll see these volumes, and they are quite expensive. I've only got volume B of the first volume, or part B of the first volume, because they're really expensive. But I've got some good news for you, because I did some research with the Washington Holocaust Museum recently, and it was about camps and ghettos, and these volumes actually tell you that there were 44,000 camps and ghettos during Holocaust in German occupied territory, and that's why there's so many of these volumes. But when I did some research there, I was able to access free volumes online and download them as PDFs. So you can now go to that site and go to the Encyclopedia of Camps and Ghettos from 1933 to 1945. If you look there, you can get a download of volume 1 and volume 2, both part A and part B of both volumes, and download them free as PDFs. It's well worth doing. It won't cost you anything. they're really valuable volumes because they talk about the detail about not only the ghettos but camps as well, and other issues regarding Holocaust. So I hope they're of help to you, and it won't cost you anything either, because these books are very expensive, and I look and wait to find a second-hand book and then buy it. So that's how I do it. But now, as I say, you can get the 2 volumes from Yad Vashem in regard to Camps and Ghettos. So tonight, we're going to look at this whole aspect of ghettos, not camps. I'm going to discuss the difference between camps and ghettos tonight, but we're going to discuss this specific program that Nazi Germany put into effect with regard to the ghettos. And let's start from the beginning of where the word came from. So in the mid-centuries in Europe, Jews tended to live in proximity to their own religious establishments and Jewish schools. Communities grew around these facilities, and walls were built by the Jewish communities for their own protection. Let's remember that Jews have been persecuted right throughout their history. And many times in the name of Jesus, Christians have persecuted them. So, as you know from previous sessions, so they built walls around them for their own protection. And the word ghetto was first used in the 16th century. In 1555, Pope Paul IX announced a papal bull which stated that there should be an established walled section of the city for the containment of Rome's Jewish population. So he actually decided that would be the case for the Jews of Rome. Now, this papal bull was called Cum Nimis Absurdum. And translated, that means, since it is absurd and utterly inconvenient that the Jews, who through their own fault were condemned by God to eternal slavery. And that's really what he was saying, that because of that they should be walled in to a ghetto in Rome. Now the Pope saw the creation of this ghetto in the 16th century as a means to contain Jews until they were converted. So he wanted them in a ghetto specifically until the time that they were converted. And you can read much more about that online, or you can get books. I've got books here on that very subject. So I've explained now about the volumes that we have here, the books from Yad Vashem, the 2 volumes there, which speak about 1,100 ghettos. These volumes detail 1,100 ghettos themselves, not camps as well, but the Holocaust Memorial Museum of Washington has now collated details of camps and ghettos, and as I've said, the number is 44,000 altogether, and they're still discovering more camps and ghettos. So you can imagine how vast this network of ghettos and camps were during Holocaust, and clearly the argument that that people didn't know what was happening to the Jews is frivolous and worthless, because with so many camps and ghettos, you couldn't avoid seeing what was going on with the Jewish communities throughout Europe under German occupied territory. So every ghetto in Holocaust was individual in terms of numbers and lengths of time that people lived in the ghettos before being taken to be murdered, either by shooting, as we saw in the killing fields last week, which was the case in the first years of the occupation, or as was the case latterly, they were taken to specific facilities like Auschwitz and Kelmo and Sobibor, where they were murdered. Those places were places of murder. Now, first of all, let's make some distinction between the camps and ghettos, because there are some distinctions between them, and you may want to take notes. But if you need any help or need anything, I can email some things to you anyway. But let's take ghettos did fragment community life of the Jews, but the ghettos didn't destroy it entirely. But the murder camps did, because there was no family life in the murder camps. They were taken and they were murdered. They were separated as well. In ghettos, Jews had some discretion over their leadership, who tried to balance the requirements of the Nazi leaders with the needs of the community. There was appointed by the Nazi leaders, Jewish leaders who were called Judenrat in the ghettos. And as I said, they weren't chosen by the Jews, they were chosen by the Nazis, so that they would follow the Nazis' directions and orders. And the Judenrat were the leaders of the Jewish people who understood the Jewish people and actually conveyed the messages back and to. And they became as well like a police force for each ghetto. And they were called the Judenrat. That didn't happen in the camps. The camps, there was no Jewish leadership. It was direct authority from the Nazis, who demanded that Jews did exactly what they were told. And if they didn't, they were killed immediately. Ghettos also, this is number 3, ghettos involved a diverse daily routine, but camps had a strict regime. So if you imagine that a ghetto, people in the ghetto had their families, they had work, there was work in the ghettos. There was a different daily regime, as there is today in our lives, isn't there? Some people go to work later, earlier, some people don't work, they stay at home and they look after the family. But in the camps, there was a strict regime. If you survived being chosen to work, or death, if you survived and started work, you started work on a particular time and you did exactly what you were told. Ghettos were also made up from Jews from local areas or districts. They, as a general rule, were not taken far from their homes to a central point nearby. But those in camps were, in the main, taken away from their districts or countries to another district or country to be murdered. So the exception really is Minsk Jews who were gathered in from the ghetto, and they were killed at the ghetto as well, or nearby in the forests. But also we see the example of what I'm saying about Jews being taken from their home and their districts to a ghetto to be murdered, to be murdered, is the example of the Hamburg and Bremen Jews in northwest Germany, who were taken from Hamburg and Bremen to Minsk, probably a 3-day journey by rail, to be murdered in the Minsk ghettos and ultimately the killing fields nearby. In ghettos, in general, family life was maintained, but in camps, people were separated. So in a ghetto, when Jews were brought into a ghetto, and we'll explain what the ghetto is very shortly. In a ghetto, when they were brought in, they remained with their family in the main, and they stayed in the family groups or the community groups, and they lived in the ghetto in those little units, family units. But in the camps, when people arrived at the camps, they were separated. So women and children were separated from the men. Twins were separated from their parents. Some children were separated. People who were fit for work were separated, and the others were taken and murdered straight away. So there was a separation. There was no family life. That's probably the main difference. In ghettos, there were mixed sexes. So people lived in a family unit, they lived with their wives, they lived as a family, so they were mixed sexes. But in camps, there was segregation. So women were kept absolutely separate from the men. in the camps. And as they arrived at the camps, if they were chosen for work, they were kept again separate. The women and men were not allowed to mix. So that was another difference between the camps and the ghettos. In ghettos, even unproductive elements of the community were left alive in the main until the camps, the ghettos were being liquidated. Such as the elderly were kept alive with children, whereas in the camps, there was no unproductive elements. So in a ghetto, if you couldn't work, you were still housed in the ghettos, and maybe because of age or sickness, etc., you were still housed in the ghetto. But if you were seen to be unproductive and couldn't work as you entered one of the killing facilities like Auschwitz, Sobibor, or Chelmo, etc., you were murdered straight away. So that was another major difference. In ghettos, Jews were being held awaiting another destination, either to be taken to their deaths by shooting, or to the death camps, or for labor elsewhere. But Jews were taken to the death camps to be murdered. They weren't taken to work or for any other reason. They were taken there to be murdered. So I hope I'm explaining this correctly for you. Well, I know I'm correct with it, but I hope you understand that ghettos were a waiting room, if you like, for another destination. So the Minsk Jews, or the German Jews who went to Minsk in the Minsk ghetto, were there and held there until they went either to be shot in the killing fields, or they went to the death camps. So it was a waiting room, really. And it's exactly the same in Vilnius ghetto, and we're going to look at Vilnius and Minsk as examples tonight. So there were waiting rooms. Whereas when you went to the camps, the vast majority were destined to be killed anyway. So there was not another place to go to. Although people did move, particularly to the end of the war, when the Russian Liberation Forces came in January 1945. Of course, Jews were taken from the death camps and on the death marches, and the Germans tried to take them out so that they wouldn't be found by the Russians. So that was the case then. But as a general rule, if you were in a ghetto, you were waiting to go somewhere, but in a camp, you were just simply waiting for death, and you didn't have to wait long either in most of the death camps. So that is another difference. So I hope you understand something about the differences between ghettos and camps. There's family life in the ghettos. They were holding pens really for waiting to go somewhere else, and but camps were death facilities. They were quite different. Similarities were also, because there would be similarities in them, similarities were that both ghettos and camps were used as a source of labor for building or production. And Neuengamme camp in northwest Germany is a good example of that. I've been there, I've seen what the camp at Neuengamme was like. So I'm going to just tell you some things about Neuengamme so that you understand the similarities. And Neuengamme as well was both a ghetto camp and a murder camp, and also a holding pen for labor forces. So Neuengamme was established in 1938 and was the first camp in northwest Germany. It eventually grew and had 75 sub-camps, many of them created to provide labor for brick building, shipyards, and the needs of the war effort. The SS Business Administration ran the camp and purchased the German Earth Stoneworks land from a private company to expand the camp. In total, there was 104,000 people who were held at the camp, who were made up of Polish prisoners of war, Russian prisoners of war, homosexuals, mainly Jews, and as I say, it was also used as a murder facility. But the SS business administration, because the SS had a business program attached to it, it was a business of killing. They bought land. Now, when I was there 4 years ago at Neuengamme, I went to the archives and I found some material which hadn't been discovered before, which was a contract between the church, which was 3 kilometers away, and the SS at the camp. And it was a contract dated 1943, whereby the church had sold a piece of land at the back of the church so that the railway line, rather than going through the town, through the city, would actually be able to go through the back of the church more directly to the camp. And the church sold the piece of land to the SS so that could happen, to build a railway line for that purpose. So it was run like a business. Many of the sub-camps that I've spoken about, the 75, were situated in Bremen, in the area, and they provided forced labor for car manufacturers such as Borgward Work, the Krupp Company, shipbuilders, Gesselman Demolition, and Scarp Company, Hermann Bodecker Construction, Heinrich Ebeling Demolition, Kurbitz and Brita Demolition, Hateman Construction, and many more other businesses. Because what happened is the business community in those cities like Bremen, Hamburg, and wherever a camp was, and this is particularly true as well in places like Lithuania, the ghetto was a center or an actually facility for labor. So they took from the ghetto daily people who could work in different industries. And in the Neuengamme network of subcamps, that was very much the case. And a lot of the workers in the Bremen subcamps to the main Neuengamme administration camp, which, as I said, was also a killing center because it had a crematorium there. That was, they took labor and actually built, they were used to build submarines for the war effort. So the labor force from the camp or the subcamps was very, very important for the production of and industry of the German war machine and daily life, of course. Now then, there was another difference in the camps, between camps and ghettos. There was a gender anomaly. 60% of the ghettos were women. And the reason for that was that the men had been conscripted to fight the Germans as the war progressed. So in the case of Russia, the Jewish men were used by the Russian army to fight the Germans, to oppose the Germans, and they did that voluntarily. But obviously, they left the ghettos. They managed to escape the ghettos, and they fought. So they were fighting men who joined the army, Russian army in particular. And there was also the seizure of men for forced labor, because forced labor wasn't just hard work, it worked you to death as well. So many of the men were taken from the ghettos, used in forced labor, and taken away as well to in different areas to be used in the war machine. Men were also murdered before women in the main. That was the general rule. In the case of Lithuania, Jewish men were murdered as the occupation began. So as Germany took over Lithuania, they took the men in particular and killed them first, and they were shot as the Germans occupied Lithuania. Now, the ghettos were very, very important when it came to the Nazis' plan to deal with what they called the Jewish question. And it involved strategic planning, because the ghettos were part of the planning process for the elimination of the Jewish people. And the planning were based on records they held about the Jewish communities throughout Europe. Now, you might say, well, how did they have records? Well, we're going to look not in the next session, but in the session after that, we're going to look at how Germany, with the aid of America, actually recorded the details of who the Jews were on data processing machines, and they knew, the Germans knew who Jews were before they went into a city or a village. They knew who they were, and they knew who the families were. So, but we're going to talk about that on a separate teaching session, and how this data was recorded. But on the 21st of December 1939, I'm talking about the planning operation for the ghettos only, Reinhard Heydrich, head of security police, sent out a directive that laid out the procedures and treatment of the Jews in the areas occupied, particularly in Poland, because that was the first place of occupation where there was a large community of Jews. In fact, there was over 3 million Jews, between 3 million and 3.5 million Jews. So Heydrich made orders about how to deal with those large populations of Jews. The directive declared that Jews living in towns and villages would be transferred to join larger populations of Jews in bigger cities. So wherever the bigger population was, then the Jews from the smaller villages were brought in to that particular area. That was the plan, and that's how it worked out. Jewish councils, known as the Judenrat, who I've just spoken about, they were like the police, the leaders chosen by the Nazi forces, should be established in each Jewish community in the ghettos. And as I've said, they were to carry out the orders of the German authorities, and they were to help to create a ordered society within the ghettos, and that's what the Judenrat were used for. Now, Jews generally were housed in the poorest neighborhoods in the city. So if you've got a large city, let's take Liverpool, because there were camps at Liverpool, but that's another story. Jews would be brought in from maybe the Wirral or Chester, maybe 40, 50, 60 miles away, smaller Jewish communities into the city center. And they were housed in the poorest neighborhoods of the city center. Now, I know when I was a police officer in 1984, we had riots in places like Toxteth because the living conditions were very, very poor in Toxteth, and people were upset, and there was riots there. Now, that's the type of place that they would create a ghetto where it was the poorest areas of a city. And eventually, when they brought in all the Jews to that particular area, the majority of the Jews were housed, and we'll look at how they were housed when we look at examples of different ghettos, because they're all different. The majority of them were incarcerated in that area, and then the ghetto was sealed. A large sealed ghetto was an area of a city, as I say, the poorest areas, and fencing would be put around there, or walls would be built, or barriers of some sort would stop Jews leaving. Now, the largest sealed ghetto was in Lodz in Poland, and that was sealed in the spring of 1940. And in the autumn of 1940, the largest of the Lodz ghetto was established. Sorry, I've got this, I'm mixed up here now. And in the autumn of 1940, another ghetto was established in Warsaw, which is where this film is about. And nearly 500,000 Jews were interned in Warsaw. In June 1940, after the initial mass killings of Jews in the Soviet region, Nazi forces created more ghettos, and these ghettos, the largest of these ghettos, were Minsk in Belarus, which had over 100,000 Jews, And ghettos were also established throughout occupied German territory. As the Nazis took control of areas, they would issue instructions to the local municipalities to isolate Jews in a particular area. So the local councils of an area, Gentile councils now, not Jewish councils, would be told to isolate the Jews from the rest of the population, separating from the rest of from everybody else in the population. That in itself created small ghettos, and then those Jews were moved into larger ghettos like Lodz and Warsaw and Minsk. Now, this one example is that of Belarus, when the Operation Barbarossa, which was Germany's attack on Russia, progressed. Not only were directives given to create the ghettos for the Jewish population, and particularly in this case in Belarus, Minsk, but also in other territories. So as the Germans move forward, they try and gather Jews in particular areas, but also they created ghettos in smaller cities and villages temporarily by using the local government, the local councils, to create those ghettos before bringing those Jews from the villages into the larger ghettos. Latvia is one case when on the 30th of July 1941, Security Division 281, and I've had this from a report, who was taking control of the Latvian communities of Jews, issued an instruction to the local government to separate Jews from the rest of the population. And this is what the directive said to the local councils. It said, the Jews' behavior requires separating the Jews in general from the rest of the population and setting them in ghettos. In August 1941, Henrik Loos issued the following directives to the city authorities under Nazi occupation. So there were directives being set all the time about how to gather Jews and keep them in ghettos. And this directive said this. There's a number of things that were said in the directive, and I'm going to read them to you. It says, to the extent possible, Jews should be concentrated in cities or in districts of large cities where there is already a predominantly Jewish population. That is where ghettos should be established. Jews must be forbidden to leave the ghettos. In the ghettos, they should only be allowed enough food as can be spared by the rest of the population. But in any case, no more than is essential for the survival of the ghetto residents. This applies equally to the supply of other essential goods. The ghetto residents will administer their internal affairs themselves under the supervision of the district or city commissioner or his representative. So as I've said, communities worked and lived in the ghettos under the Judenrat, under the Jewish leadership, but at the directives, under the directions of the Nazis or the city councils. Number 5, it says that I've written that the Jews can be enlisted into a police force to maintain its internal order. This is what I'm saying about the Judenrat. They are to be equipped at most with rubber truncheons and batons, and will wear white armbands with a yellow Jewish star on their right upper arms. So the Judenrat, as I've said, were police given weapons to maintain order. And they also had to have yellow stars on their clothing, but also they had white armbands as well to show that they were part of the Judenrat, the Jewish leadership. An auxiliary police of local inhabitants, this is a part of the directive, should be used to guard the ghetto hermetically, making it airtight on the outside. So they were saying to the directives that came from Loos made it very clear that the councils had to make the ghetto airtight so that nobody could enter or leave without permission. And Directive 7 is admission to the ghetto will require the approval of the district commissioner. So you couldn't get out of the ghetto unless you had permission to do so. So you can imagine now that the city councils, the governors of the councils who were not Nazis, not part of the SS, but they had to control the ghettos. And then within the ghetto authority structure, there was the Judenrat, who were the Jewish police or Jewish leadership that kept order, but also helped in the ghetto to maintain life as it was best lived in such terrible circumstances. So what did the ghettos mean to the Nazis? This is an important question. For the Nazis, ghettos were simply gathering and holding pens for large Jewish communities until it was decided how and when those occupants would be disposed of. So it was just really a holding area, and as I've said earlier, a waiting room. That's what a ghetto meant to the Nazis, because they were going to eliminate the Jews of Europe. They weren't holding them there so that they could have a better life elsewhere, which is what the ghetto communities were told when they were being liquidated. It was simply to hold them in a contained area until they decided how they were going to kill them, using gas fans. Now, I asked you if you may have to look at the gas fans on Google last week. You may have done that, but using all sorts of things like shooting or gas fans, or towards the latter part of the war, the killing facilities like Auschwitz, Sobibor, and Kelman. But that's what they were. That's what a ghetto meant to the Nazis. But what did a ghetto mean to the Jews? Because that's a valid question as well. They were the ones who were living in there. So what did it mean for Jews, a ghetto, when they heard they were going to a ghetto? To the Jew, they were a place to survive until the next day. And we'll read, when we look at ghettos, we'll look at how Jews were treated in the ghettos, and you will understand then the meaning to survive until the next day. Jews use the word I believe in, which means to outlive, to outlast, to live on in the ghetto. Jews recognized that they had to find ways in ghettos to live until they were moved to an unknown place, or they died. So they recognized that they had to find a way of surviving the terrible situation they'd found themselves in the ghetto. And the word again, I'll repeat it. It's I believe in, meaning to outlive, to outlast, and to live on in the ghetto. So it meant different things to the Nazis and different to the Jews. Now, the Nazi forces succeeded in a number of goals by establishing the ghettos. They succeeded in this process of the elimination of Jews by using the ghettos. And let's go through some of the aspects of that. It was enabling them to gather large numbers of Jews together under conditions of severe congestion, but they were able to contain them and hold them tight, airtight, as I've said already. They were able to supervise these large and in some cases small Jewish communities much more easily in a ghetto. They had them in one place. So it enabled them to have control over the Jewish communities. They were also able to deprive Jews of their property by moving them from their homes and businesses in one place to another place where they had little or nothing. And this helped finance the war effort. So if Jews lived in one part of the city, and they lived in big houses, maybe not all Jews did, because some were very poor, but if they lived in a big house, they had a big business, then the business was taken from them, their housing was taken from them, and they were put into maybe a ramshackle flat in the poorer areas of the city. And the money used, the gain used by taking the Jewish property was used for the war effort. And actually it was recorded very, very carefully by the Germans what property was taken from the Jews. They were also able to exploit the labor force, enabling factories to continue to produce items for the war effort, and like Neuengamme, as I've explained, and to construct much needed property. Auschwitz was actually built by Jewish labor, by the same company, Farben, who made the gas which ultimately killed them. It also isolated Jews from other communities and from the rest of the world, and made them very, very vulnerable because they were on their own. They were separated. Nobody could, and in most cases didn't want to help them. So they were isolated. They were polarized from the rest of the community. This isolation caused the communities around them to hate and resent them and condemn them as the ghetto was an intrusion in the city. So they felt as if it was a place where there was a lot of disease, a lot of death, and they didn't want that in their city. So they resented it. So they were very happy, the people in the cities, to see the liquidation of the ghettos. So the ghettos were not welcome in cities. And also there was another side to it as well. Some ghettos were seen as objects of financial exploitation by not only the SS, but by large and small local businesses. So we see in some of the ghettos, the bakers would make money selling bread at exorbitant rates to the Jewish communities in the ghettos. They would go and sell bread through the fence, make a lot of money. But also large businesses would take the Jews out of the ghetto for work in their factories, again to make profit. They also made large Jewish communities feel unprepared for future events. So you can imagine being taken into a ghetto. You'd lost your home, you'd lost your business, you'd lost your livelihood, and you're taken to a ghetto. How would you feel about the future? You'd feel unprepared, wouldn't you? You've got nothing at all. So that's how Jewish communities felt. Now, the historian Werner Rings notes different Jewish approaches to surviving ghetto life. So the approaches are quite different in some ways, because you've got to survive in a ghetto. Now, personal resistance by maintaining dignity and identity is one. Jews tried to maintain dignity and identity. They tried to keep the Sabbath. They tried to keep the feast. They tried to keep the Jewish practices. They tried to keep Shabbat evenings by lighting the candles and singing, and they tried to maintain their dignity by using the giftings or the professional trades that they had, and they kept their family life the best way they could under most extreme conditions. But it was a personal resistance if you could keep the Sabbath, or keep your family safe, or open up the Sabbath on a Friday night, or keep Passover. You were maintaining your religious dignity and your identity, and they felt that was resistance, and of course it was. Also, by disseminating information about Nazi crimes to other communities, authorities, and allied nations, they would do their best to try and get information out to other communities, Jewish communities in other places, so that would go back and be reported to the nations, the allied nations, such as the UK, America, and other nations, but particularly the UK and America. And actually a lot of information got out through Jewish leadership networks to the British government and the American government, and the people who who had sent that information out felt quite rightly that that was part of their resistance to what was happening in the ghetto. There was defensive resistance by aiding and protecting their fellow captives. Of course, if they could help, and they did help enormously with each other's lives, they tried to support each other's lives. That was a way of resisting. And also offensive, and in many cases armed resistance, either by an individual or a group, which also included escape, because people did escape ghettos. And if we look, when we look at Minsk, you'll see all these things in play. Now, armed resistance did break out in a number of ghettos, and usually occurred when information of the liquidation of a ghetto came to light, and information as to the final destination. So in Lodz Ghetto or Warsaw Ghetto, when they heard about the liquidation, then usually young youth groups who managed to get armed and managed to try and make weapons, responded by resisting against the guards, which were from the country of where the ghetto is, and the SS. So they fought against them, and as I say, you'll see that in this film, Out of the Ashes. Sorry, not Out of the Ashes, The Pianist, I'm sorry. Now, the option they had, if it was an option, was either to go on the offensive against the guards and army forces, knowing the likely outcome, or dying one of the growing number of murder camps, because many in the ghetto knew about the murder camps. Some didn't, but many did. And one example is that Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Now, after the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was after the deportations to Treblinka in the summer of 1942, the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto, led by Mordecai Anelowitz, barricaded themselves in bunkers and resisted the German action of April 1943. After a month of valiant fighting, the uprising was quashed, and the ghetto was actually burnt to the ground, as you'll see from the film. On the 22nd of July 1942, on the eve of the 9th of Av in the Jewish calendar, the Germans began this mass deportation from the Warsaw Ghetto. By the time they ended on the 21st of Yom Kippur, which is a Jewish festival, or one of God's festivals actually, celebrated by the Jewish people, by then some 260,000 inhabitants of the ghetto had been deported to Treblinka and other extermination camps. So you can imagine the size of the Warsaw Ghetto. 260,000 inhabitants had been deported amidst this uprising. Now, after the deportations to Treblinka, between 55,000 to 60,000 Jews remained in the Warsaw Ghetto, and they were concentrated in a few built-up areas. The area of the ghetto was thus severely reduced, and conditions continued to be unbearable as this uprising carried on. The final action to liquidate the ghetto took place on the 19th of April, 1943, which was the eve of Passover, which was often the case with German actions. They did things to break the celebrations of Passover, Sabbath, and other celebrations. The fighting groups, the resistance, who, as I've said, were mainly youth groups, barricaded themselves in bunkers and hideouts. Their resistance sometimes took the Nazis by surprise. In response, the Nazis began to systematically burn down the buildings of the Warsaw Ghetto, turning the ghetto basically into a fire trap. But the Jews fought valiantly for a whole month until the Nazis took control and murdered the remaining resistance fighters. Warsaw Ghetto Uprising is probably the most famous ghetto uprising, but there were uprisings in many other ghettos. The idea that Jews were like sheep to the slaughter was not entirely true at all. Jews resisted in so many ways. It wasn't true that they were led like sheep to the slaughter. They fought hard and even on personal resistance as well as fighting. So starvation and disease were the physical consequences of ghetto life, but mental health was also affected with the constant threat of being murdered, dying, or starving to death, or being treated brutally, which was often the case. Fear, therefore, became the focus of many of ordinary Jewish people's emotions. There were also many acts of kindness in the ghettos, acts of faith, and acts of immense bravery by the ghetto residents in aid of their community. The sharing of food, raw material, and constant efforts to normalize life by creating schools, theatres, and arts classes were all ways in which those with skills and gifting shared them for the benefit of all in the ghettos. Poets, artists, musicians, all became vital workers in the fight to normalize life. Again, you'll see that in this film, The Pianist. These things can't and shouldn't be forgotten. These heroic efforts were all forms of resistance in the ghetto. Now, Lodz Ghetto was liquidated in the summer of 1944, and none of the ghettos in Poland were standing when the Russian army liberated Poland in January 1945. I'm going to look at a couple of ghettos now, just to tell you a bit of the story about the Budapest ghetto in Hungary. Was still functioning at the beginning of 1945. So they lasted for different periods of time. They started at different years, and they were closed as well, or liberated at certain times as well. And interestingly, there were also mobile camps, mobile ghettos, which were large train carriages full of prisoners. And they were workers organized by the SS administration again. And their primary task was to repair any damaged railway lines as a result of bombing raids. Now, these mobile ghettos would normally have 50 carriages, half of which housed prisoners, and the other half housed officers, accommodation, and the administrative officers, and of course the equipment. And these mobile camps, these mobile ghettos rather, would carry people from different parts of the occupied territory to repair the railway lines, which were much needed for the transports of Jews from the ghettos to the death camps, and also for other reasons for the war effort. So these were mobile ghettos where people lived, Jews were held in carriages and were used for labor and mobile units. Now, many Jews were killed in these mobile units, and many people were treated really badly because they were slave labor force. And despite these mobile units being really very cruel, nobody from the guards who were looking after these mobile units were ever brought to justice in the Nuremberg trials after the war. I'm going to go back to Lodz Ghetto now. And it was liquidated in the summer of 1944, and none of the ghettos in Poland were still standing when the Russian army liberated Poland. So when the Russians came into Poland, there were no ghettos left. The Budapest ghetto in Hungary, however, was still functioning, as I've said, in 1945. Now let's look at Lodz Ghetto. If we have time to go through these ghettos with you, I'd like to tell you some of the details. So before the war, the population in Lodz was 233,000 Jews. Obviously, they were part of the city of Lodz. On the 10th of December 1939, an order was issued to create a ghetto in Lodz, and we've seen the directives from this guy, Los, haven't we? That would be the directive. The order made it very clear that this was a temporary measure until the Jews of Lodz could be murdered. So on the 10th of December 1939, as Germany take over the city of Lodz, this order is given, and it says, the establishment of the ghetto is obviously just a provisional measure. The ultimate goal must be the elimination of this pestilence. So that shows or gives evidence that for my statement saying that the ghettos were simply a holding pen for Jews until they went to be killed in whatever facility that was. Now, on the 8th of February 1940, the official order establishing the ghetto was published, and the transfer of Jews into the area of the slum part of the old city began. The ghetto was sealed, Lodz Ghetto was sealed on the 1st of May 1940. Hundreds of Jews were shot by guards during its initial period, which instilled fear in the population of the ghetto. So Jews would be killed by the guards to instill fear, to bring order, if you will. Now, 170,000 Jews were housed in Lodz Ghetto, crammed into an area of 4 square kilometers, meaning that there was an average of 10 people per room. Starvation and disease was a primary killer in the ghetto. And in 1942 alone, 18,000 Jews died in Lodz Ghetto. A total of 44,000 Jews died in the ghetto of hunger and disease during the period of the ghetto. Jews in the ghetto created 100 factories, and that was to supply the Germans with their needs. But what it meant for the Jewish people is that large numbers of Jews, men, women, and children, were prevented from being deported to their deaths because they were held in the ghetto to produce things for the war effort. So it was a way of surviving, creating a factory, creating a workshop, doing something that would benefit the Germans' war effort would help you to survive the ghetto. Now, 90% of the population in the Lodz Ghetto were employed in these factories. That's quite a high percentage. However, murder operations were regular. The guards would go in and shoot large numbers of Jews in the ghetto to keep that element of fear going. So on the 8th of December 1941, Kelmo Death Facility was opened just 60 kilometers from Lodz. So the Nazis created a death facility at Kelmo simply as a murder facility for the residents of the Lodz Ghetto because they were going to liquidate the ghetto. That was the purpose of the ghetto. It wasn't to keep Jews alive. It was to hold them until there was a place for them to be murdered. Now, the first transport from Lodz were gypsy prisoners. And from the 16th of January to May 1942, 55,000 Jews were taken from transports from Lodz Ghetto to Kelmo, where they were gassed, because Kelmo was a specially made gassing facility for Jews, a murder facility for them. The first transports of the 55,000 Jews were mainly elderly or infirm or weak or children. Now, during 1943, there were disputes between the SS and private companies and government authorities with regards to the liquidation of the ghetto. The SS wanted to liquidate the ghetto, but the local government and local businesses wanted to keep the ghetto going because the ghetto was making huge profits for private firms and government functionaries. And they didn't want to see the labor force in these 100 factories disappearing to Kelmo, just 60 kilometers down the road or down the railway line. So there was a lot of disputes, and there's a lot of records about the arguments between the authorities and the SS. Kelmo, however, was not capable of murdering the numbers of Jews they were receiving from Lodz. Between the 23rd of June to the 14th of July 1944, 7,000 Jews were sent from the ghetto to Kelmo and murdered. The facility at Kelmo was struggling to deal with that number of Jews in just that short space of time, actually 3 weeks. Now, as the Russian army approached Poland, The German forces were faced with liquidating the ghetto as quick as they could. So 67,000 Jews from Lodz were then sent on transports to Auschwitz to help with the elimination process much more quickly, before the Russian army arrived and liberated the ghetto in Lodz. When they did arrive at Lodz, there was 1,000 remaining prisoners, and that was on the 19th of July, 1945. So 170,000 inhabitants of Lodz ghetto was reduced to 1,000. Now, the Budapest ghetto in Hungary, if you bear with me, we're just at the end of the session, but I'd like to go on and just finish describing a couple more ghettos, if you don't mind. Budapest ghetto in Hungary. In 1900, the Jewish population of Budapest was 170,000, which was around 25% of the total population of the city. In 1941, there were 184,453 Jews registered in Budapest who professed Judaism, and 37,931 Jews who had been converted to Christianity. And this was out of a total city population of Budapest of 1,164,963 people altogether. Now, you might say, well, how do we know these figures? Well, because of this data collection that took place, which we're going to look at in the next few sessions. So this is in Budapest, the first anti-Jewish laws in Hungary were instituted, first of all, by the Hungarian government in 1938, not the German army. This was before the war, by the Hungarian government. Jews were moved into positions of being used as forced labor. But by 1942, Jews who could not prove Hungarian citizenship were deported out of Hungary completely. On the 19th of March 1944, the German army occupied Hungary and began a program to make Hungary free of Jews, Judenrein. That's Juden-free, Jew-free. That was the program. That was in March 1944. As they occupied Budapest, they established a Jewish council, Judenrat, and in June 1944, the mayor of Budapest designated 2,000 houses in the city, which he called Yellow Star houses. And on the 24th of June, he required the 200,000 Jews of the city to move into those houses. So that's 200,000 Jews to move into 2,000 of the poorest houses in the city, of course. This meant 19,000 apartments were vacated by Gentiles who were forced to make room for the Jews, but they took the better properties of the Jewish homes in Budapest. So you can see the crossover. On the 15th of October 1944, the Hungarian right-wing Arrow Cross Party, supported by the Nazis, began to take men from 16 years to 60 years and women from 16 years to 40 years for forced labor. In all, 25,000 younger, able-bodied people were taken out of the ghetto of Budapest for forced labor. The ghetto was sealed in November 1944 with fencing and which was heavily guarded. The residents of the ghetto were allowed just between 700 to 800 calories per day, and of course conditions were really poor. There were no facilities for garbage or to bury the dead after December 1944. When the dead were piled up in courtyards outside the hospitals, which were maintained by the Jewish community. In January 1945, approximately 10,000 Jews were moved from one small ghetto area to a larger ghetto area when the Arrow Cross Party, these were not Germans, these were Hungarian right-wing activists took them to the Danube river and pushed them into the river, shooting them as they went in. So this took place in January 1945. 10,000 Jews were taken out of the ghetto and pushed into the Danube River, where they were shot and drowned. That wasn't by the Nazis, that was by the right-wing Hungarians. From January 1945, no Jews were allowed outside the ghetto, and when the ghetto was liberated on the 13th of February 1945, 3,000 unburied bodies were scattered throughout the ghetto. There was nowhere to bury them. Over half of the inhabitants of the ghetto had been transported to the death camps, and actually only 70,000 Jews survived, and that was at the end of the war. Hungary was liberated on the 4th of April 1945, and in the weeks following the liberation, thousands of Jews who were in the ghetto continued to die from hunger, disease, and exhaustion in the same way Jews did in Belsen. Now, Minsk ghetto, I just want to, if you've got 5 minutes, I'll just explain what happened in Minsk, so you can see that the principles that we spoke about earlier work out in these other ghettos. So according to the 1939 census in Minsk, 71,000 Jews lived in the city. 6 days after Germany began the offensive against the Soviet Union, which was 1941, they reached Minsk. Germans reached the city and occupied it. The suddenness of the invasion made it just happened so quickly. The Russians didn't expect Minsk to be taken so quickly by the Germans, but under Operation Barbarossa, Germany moved very quickly. Immediately, the German occupation forces arrested 2,000 Jewish professionals and political activists, who they called the Jewish intelligentsia, and they were shot immediately. So as soon as they got in the city, they took the professional men and political activists and shot them. They knew who they were from these data collection machines, as I've said. A Judenrat was appointed, Jewish leadership, by the German forces at the beginning of July to establish the leadership through which they could issue directives. Jews from the city and surrounding areas were registered by the 15th of July, and all Jews were ordered to wear yellow stars on their clothing. On the 19th of July, orders were issued to create a ghetto comprising of 34 streets and alleys within 2 square kilometers, which housed 100,000 Jews. I've been to this ghetto, and it was just so cramped for them. The ghetto was so overcrowded, 2 or 3 families lived in the one room. I went with a friend of mine, Keith Darnell, and we were shocked at the state of the conditions that these people lived in. Minsk Jews were prevented from using electricity, oil lamps, or candles. They were forced to use only one tap for the whole community. The daily food rations were 875 grams of bread, 100 grams of flour, and 30 grams of rotten vegetables, and 5 grams of salt. Immediately the ghetto opened in June 1941, a resistance unit was formed in the ghetto by 2 men, Hirsch Schmoller and Nathan Feldman. In all, under the leadership of a number of other resistance fighters working with them, 7 resistance units were created in the ghetto, and that their goal was to flee to the forests and help others escape, and they actually did. It is estimated by the time of the liquidation of the ghetto in October 1943, nearly 10,000 Jews had escaped to the ghetto with the help of these men, and they survived starvation and managed to escape. In November 1941, 7 transports of Jews with 1,000 in each transport arrived in Minsk from Hamburg, Bremen, Dusseldorf, Brünn, Frankfurt, and Vienna. And these contained Jews who were taken from Germany to Minsk. Most of these were shot on arrival in specially prepared pits, at nearby Mali Trostenets, which was a place of killing. It was a murder facility, and myself and Keith had been there as well. And only 10 of these Jews survived. Jews from Germany continued to arrive and were placed in what became known as the Hamburg section of the ghetto. Minsk Jews were also taken to Mali Trostenets to be shot. But 15,000 Jews were shot on the 7th of November 1941 in prepared pits at a location called Tunitska, within the short distance of the ghetto, that was within the city, to make room for the German Jews coming in. On the 20th of November, a further 8,000 Jews were murdered at the same location. One survivor myself and Keith spoke to when we visited the Minsk ghetto and the memorials there told us that the killing was so horrible that the streets from the ghetto was on a hill, the streets were like blood. There were regular raids on the ghetto, and families would be shot indiscriminately during 1941. Abductions of men between the ages of 15 and 45 years were carried out, and these men were shot. During the winter 1942 and 1941 and 1942, numbers of Jews who died in the ghetto of disease and starvation were unknown. It was so many. On the 2nd of March 1942, German SS, accompanied by Latvians and Ukrainians, entered the ghetto, but most of the Jews had gone into hiding. The children they found in the orphanages were taken and thrown alive into pits. And by evening that day, they'd seized those returning from the work parties, and those found hiding, and murdered on that day a total of 7,000 Jews in one day. Regular attacks on the ghettos continued, and on the 29th of March, 6,500 Jews and 3,500 German Jews were murdered in the gas vans. These figures are those recorded by the SS, but survivors estimate the numbers in total who were murdered that day by gassing was 25,000. Only 11,000 Jews remained in the ghetto during August 1942. There was a delay in any further liquidation of the ghetto, as there was a need in Minsk for skilled labor for the munitions factories and for train building, so they didn't liquidate the ghetto. They held it open for the workforces. In the spring of 1943, the liquidation of the ghetto was initiated. First to be murdered were the children, the elderly, the infirm, and the sick. Many were taken in transports to Sobibor death camp, which was a specific death facility for nothing else, just murdering Jews. By the 1st of October 1943, only 2,000 Jews remained in the ghetto. And on the 21st of October 1943, the ghetto was cordoned off, and the remaining Jews were taken away and murdered. After this, the SS blew up houses and shot those who remained in the ghetto. So I'm sorry this session has been a bit longer than you're normally used to, but I wanted to finish it off, and I hope I've been able to tell you some of the principles in creating ghettos, the principles for the purpose of the ghettos, and also how the Jews resisted, and also, of course, how the ghettos were liquidated. So I'm sorry I won't be with you next week. I hope that you enjoy the film, The Pianist, and I hope that what I've been able to impart to you tonight will make more sense when you see this film. So I want to say good night, and I will see you at the same time a week on Wednesday, and we look at transports. So thank you. Good night.